out that I, in my capacity of a facilitator and course coordinator in my university, encourage my students. And would like to see that happening here this evening as well. We are more than aware how the NEP lays an enormous stress on student-centric, or what is also called learner-centric education, rather than the top-downwards phenomenon of teacher-centric education all of us grew up with. Therefore, it is time to unlearn. Permit me to initiate with the confession that as I grew up as a student of art and its history, I had known Gopal Ghosh as an artist from a meager reference of the small monograph published by the Lalit Kala Academy way back in 1966, carrying an introductory text by the remarkable scholar Jaya Appaswamy. I did hear a message beep. Since I cannot see anything excepting the PowerPoint, which is full screen, please let me know. I would rather welcome vocal messages if they are directed to me. If they're general messages, I will overlook them.
But আপনার কিন্তু ফুল স্ক্রিন হয়নি এখনো।
এখনো হয়নি?
না না, আপনাকে দেখতে পাচ্ছি। এটা ফুল স্ক্রিন, মানে এখনো পর্যন্ত জয়ার একটু
আমার এখানে আমি তো ফুল স্ক্রিন করে দিয়েছি, কিন্তু ওটা ওদিকে কেন দেখা যাচ্ছে না এটা তো একটু দাঁড়ান দেখি কি করা যায়। একান্তই যদি ফুল স্ক্রিন না হয়, দাঁড়ান দেখছি। এখনো হলো না?
না না, এখনো হয়নি।
না, এখনো হয়নি। স্যার, আপনি শেয়ার ওই এন্টায়ার স্ক্রিনে ওইখানে ক্লিক করেছেন তো?
হ্যাঁ, তাই করেছি, কিন্তু তাতে ওই ইনফিনিটি মিররিং হয়। হ্যাঁ, ইনফিনিটি মিররিং হয় বলেই আমি ওই দ্বিতীয় অপশনটা দিয়েছিলাম। তাহলে আমাকে
ছিল,
তাহলে সম্ভবত আমাকে সরি একটু অপেক্ষা করবেন, যদি আরেকবার রিশেয়ার করে দেখছি।
হ্যাঁ, রিশেয়ার করুন।
এখনো হলো না? এবার হয়েছে? এবার হয়েছে। Thank you so much for correcting the error.
পরিষ্কার আছে।
আরেকবার ফিরে যাই। Permit me to initiate with the confession that as I grew up as a student of art and its history, I had known Gopal Ghosh as an artist from as meager a reference as the small monograph published by the Lalit Kala Academy way back in 1966, carrying an introductory text by the remarkable scholar Jaya Appaswamy. Images in that monograph are mostly monochrome, with very few in color, and that too sometimes impacted by the registration shifts of early printing techniques that failed to make much impact beyond the obvious. Somehow, the notion of the lyrical, the calligraphic flourish, and landscape as predominantly the engagement of the artist became associated with our perception of Gopal Ghosh. Part of it had to do with how few examples were then available to us compared to the scale and proportion of what is now accessible. And now that we get to see images of a wider expanse, our notion of what an artist's lifelong effort means is bound to change. And I have on screen two images from two different phases of the artist's career. On the left-hand side is a slightly early painting. On the right-hand side is slightly later painting. More than the chronology of the early and the late, they are two different kinds of paintings that speak about two different kinds of moods, two different kinds of expressive capacity. And even for people who are not, unfortunately like us, into the visual day in and day out, 24/7, I'm sure that how the lines move across the sheet of paper and the nature of their rhythm and the way that the color is splashed onto the paper would very distinctly be different from the image on the left to the image on the right. Even more than the documentary material I could access as a doctoral scholar through the mid-1990s and early 2000s, trying to look at the decade of the 40s in Bengal, opportunity to engage deeper with my chosen period as of concern came initially with a lavish 2011 project around the artist Chitra Prasad, courtesy the Delhi Art Gallery. And then in 2013, the opportunity to pen a monograph on the paintings of Gopal Ghosh for a retrospective organized by the Akar Prakar Gallery of Kolkata in association with the National Gallery of Modern Art, and the publication being hosted by the Mappin Publishing of Ahmedabad. In both instances, I had the fortunate opportunity of access to a body of work as well as archival material, which had I been able to access during my doctoral study, I should have written my thesis absolutely differently. Nevertheless, let me also state an obvious caveat that I do not consider myself to be the sole authority on these two artists, any art, an artist for that matter. There are scholars who are even more informed and hold much greater original propositions than what I'm capable of, and this is no statement of humility. I did begin from a youthful ambition to reconsider why the 40s in Bengal lay around the periphery of art historical narratives, and probably dreamt of doing a success and failure around the people and their efforts. I hope some of you will be able to catch the reference. The success and failure refers to John Burge's text on Picasso. It's called The Success and Failure of Picasso. So I almost, in my youthful enthusiasm, wanted to do a success and failure of the 1940s in Bengal. But I was no missionary inscribing the artist back into history. It was more a self-quest to figure out what exactly was at stake. And when I mean what was at stake, I mean these omissions from the larger national trajectory and mapping of what is called modern and what is called contemporary. And I realized that the established dictum of three broad trajectories for the period in the region of Bengal was a good starting point. Although I'm sure there are more strands that make up the complex weave, which some scholar will someday lay bare for us to be enriched with. The first of the so-called strands is the social realist mode, including Chitra Prasad, and obviously others. I'm sure you'd be aware of them, Zainul Abedin and Somnathor, and many more. The second, the phenomenon of the Calcutta group, which is decidedly and declared formal modernist practice. And the third is well articulated and recorded by scholars, which is the transgressions of the Bengal school at Shantiniketan. All three of them become very significant because in the 40s, the decade of the 40s, they map out the transitory shift from what we call tradition towards a relatively more contemporaneous definition of the modern. And that definition of the modern will distinctively differ from how the modern was being defined so long, especially under what is the dual definitions of tradition and modernity, not tradition or modernity. So that which happened during the phase when we have artists like Abanindranath Tagore leading on to Nandalal Bose, leading on to the followers and students that constitute what we call the Bengal school phenomenon. Now, this first and the second are areas which were gray to me because documentation, as we call them, something that we lay a great emphasis on when we do our doctoral studies within visual art, putting together material that can build up a corpus which you can rely on of empirical material, the visuals themselves, the paintings, the sculptures, visuals that mark out the period. The first and the second were quite horrifyingly less. So one of my responsibilities was to try and put together as much as I could of visual images that can stand in for an identity of what we call the Calcutta group and the constituent member artists of that group. The Calcutta group existed for a decade, which is 1943 to 1953. And this 10-year-long life of the group is a very interesting period to chart. It's also interesting from the point of view that it is constantly contrasted with a more younger group which came up in Mumbai, or what was called Bombay then, called the Progressive Artist Group in Mumbai. And they were a short-lived group which was only for 1948 and 49. It is this collective to which Gopal Ghosh belonged, which is the Calcutta group, and he belonged to it as a founder member. though he dissociated later, and it is here that my quest for locating him began. So one of the issues was this very infantile intention to try and see why was it that all over Bombay and Delhi, the progressive artist group in Mumbai were preferred and privileged over the Calcutta group. Why was it that it was such a huge burden of tradition in the area of Bengal, so that the Bengal school remained as a huge load to overcome? And I believe that it's not very easy for a place that has a very strong tradition to actually come up with an equally strong statement of the counter statement of the modern, so that it can look firebrand. It is easier for places that do not have that pressure behind it. So all of that taken together maps a very complicated terrain that we must be able to comprehend. Presently, I do not have the ability to cross beyond that which I had penned for the 2013 monograph, which was mentioned when I was being introduced, which is called the book by Akar Prakar. And in that book, there was this word that has been used and which came up later on as a word of contention, the word jubilant. So here was this book, which is 2013. I do not really have the capacity because of availability of new material, for that matter, to go beyond what I had achieved then, nor beyond its reappraisal in a more recent 2023-24 collection of essays published by the Delhi Art Gallery, where I had this opportunity to take a re-look at what I had written a decade earlier and then resituate myself and also probably correct myself. So as a discerning audience and viewer, you will surely be able to come up with your own perception and might even refute me from what I'm going to present, which I will most courteously welcome. A student at the Department of History of Art in Shantiniketan had initially pointed out to me that the word jubilant, the term jubilant in the subtitle of the 2013 monograph was indeed problematic. I admit, it is problematic. And despite what I had written in the introductory paragraph of the text, which I will request your patience to hear as I read out. And here's a quote of the passage from that 2013 essay, which I'd like you to carefully take note of, because it reveals something about an artist who is a member, a founder member of an artist group, and situates his preferred individual, personal, visual language in which he wanted to articulate himself, two of which we see on screen at the moment. How do we comprehend that? So here's the quote from my own text. Quite often, we tend to suffer from an inescapable propensity to typify an artist in terms of his or her stylistic preference, linguistic characteristic, thematic choice, and mode of expression. Such an act inclines towards classifying iconic images as the sole identifying characteristic, thereby limiting an artist within the confined perimeter of signature styles and dismissing all differences as aberrations beyond the normative. Reification operates from the compelling tendency to simplify experience by assuming constancy as far as possible. To those who are fortunately familiar with the name, Gopal Ghosh almost invariably suggests an inseparable synonymy with brilliant passages in pure chromatic delight and a calligraphic flourish in an effortlessly fluidity of the line, whether the theme be flowers, birds, or landscapes. However, an element of this celebratory is but one aspect of this significant artist, even if it be the comprehensive, the most pronounced within his personal language. When one refers to a reasonably comprehensive range of examples from the entire oeuvre of the artist, one comes face to face with examples that cross beyond the presumed schema, thereby revealing to the changing times that he was traversing through. Such a range does not necessarily represent a resolved finality, but serves as a pointer to the tumultuous quest within that necessitated active negotiation on the part of the artist as an individual. It is in fact such a dynamic of tendencies that would serve to illuminate the significance of an artist like Gopal Ghosh when viewed contextually with respect to the time and the locale he was operating within. Unquote. If there was an opportunity to rewrite this essay today, once all over again. The subtitle would perhaps read more appropriately as a fervent or passionate quest for the chromatic rather than the jubilant. As an artist collective, the Calcutta Group, of which Gopal Ghosh was a founder member, went through several reconstitutions in its membership. Over the years since its inception in 1943, the infamous year of the Bengal famine, more popularly known as Panchasher Monnantar, from the year 1350 of the Bengali era. Now, ending in 1953, it is very significant that that was the year in which they held an exhibition, the last exhibition as a collective. And during that exhibition, they brought out a publication, a very small booklet, which is popularly known as the Calcutta Group Handbook. It's a small booklet with monochrome images and a text representing the group's efforts, published to mark their exhibition in that year, notwithstanding the possibility of hindsight modifying the declaration. It is worth taking note of how they defined their intentions for coming together and their objectives and goals to be reached. A couple of quotes from this anonymous text would be useful to comprehend the collective. And it's very interesting that the text doesn't have an author mention, it's anonymous, as if it's the collective voice of the group, and that too a group that went through numerous reconstitutions of its membership. So the Calcutta Group wrote, and I quote, "In the West, kings have long been dethroned and the reins of the state have passed into the hands of the common man. Today, the artists no longer decorate the Baroque palaces of kings or the interior of chapels, but work independently in the studios or decorate the communal buildings. The great French movements in art, Impressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, etc., all evolved through this changed ideal in art. Such a movement is underway in our country too. The guiding motto of our group is best expressed in the slogan, art should be international and interdependent. In other words, our art cannot progress or develop if we keep looking back to our past glories and cling to our old traditions at all costs. During the past 300 years, the world outside of India has made vast strides in art, have evolved epoch-making discoveries in forms and techniques." Please note the words. "It is absolutely necessary for us to close this hiatus by taking advantage of these developments in the Western world." And I can't put it in italics as I speak, but the words that I would love to put in italics is international and interdependent, and the words forms and techniques. The first is this brilliantly optimistic aim from a youngly, it's a nation that has just been formed in 1940, around that date, 1945. It's just formed. It's just come into being. It just crossed over 1943 as the harrowing experience of the famine into 1946, which is the harrowing experience of the riots, which are communal riots, and then comes 1947 and the 15th of August. So that's the history. So in such a circumstance, if in 1953, just 10 years after the famine, and probably some 6 years after the independence as we know it today, if a group of artists claim that it's the time for art to be international and interdependent, here are two very significant words to be taken into account. Here are artists who are no longer looking back into their national treasures of the past, as it was happening in the just preceding era. And here was a young nation claiming for itself, almost in line with the Nehruvian optimism, that there is something called interdependence. We are not dependent on somebody else, but that somebody else also needs us in whatever way it may be in 1953. That is something that, even if you're taking with a pinch of salt, is at least something which is proclaimed by the group as their objective and their aim and goal. And the two other words are forms and techniques, where they clearly underline that their efforts has got nothing to do with the thematic content. And so they are not actually thinking of the famine in terms of something that you thematically pick up so that you can make people conscious and aware of the calamitous situation and the experience of the debasement of humanity. which was quite glaringly in front of everyone, although probably down the streets of Calcutta, people would literally not look at all those dying corpses and carcasses on the roads and streets. They would rather not look at people scavenging the dustbins for the last morsel of food just to survive. They would rather not hear the wail that went around from corner to corner of the street saying, "Fan thou," just requesting for the rights charge that was being drained down from the houses of the people who could afford to drain them out. And that is the period that we have come across and come over. And 10 years down the line in 1953, here is the Calcutta group looking back at their decade-long existence, trying to sum it up. Obviously through hindsight, there's no doubting it, but also spelling out in the process how they came together, why they came together, and how that should be significant. So the handbook goes on to explain its impulse in coming together as follows. Quote, "Man is supreme, there is none above him." This was the guiding slogan when the Calcutta group was formed in 1943. Those were dark days for Bengal. Famine and pestilence were then stalking the land. The barbarity and the heartlessness all around us moved us, a few young artists, very deeply. We began to think, to search our hearts and ask ourselves, which way? Unquote. For those of you who are aware of the domain of visual practice, it should be obvious from the choice of French movements quoted in the note. And I'm referring to the three movements actually mentioned: Impressionism, Cubism, Surrealism. Please take note that nothing else, although they mention etc., they mention very clearly Impressionism, Cubism, Surrealism. The first of the movements, Impressionism, was the first break with what we call tradition and the first entry into the modern for the European world, where they stepped aside beyond verisimilitude of realism into something which is not, where one could actually draw in the fact that you could be still painting identifiable landscapes, cityscapes, human figures, gardens, boats, etc. But once you moved close to the canvas, you saw nothing else but rapidly placed, pure color brushstrokes that rippled with energy. So there was this duality of moving close to the canvas and moving away from the canvas. As you moved away, you could actually identify the identifiable likeness of the theme. As you moved close, you were more aware of the grammar and the vocabulary of painting, so that you could see how it was being enacted, how it was happening. So that's the duality within Impressionism. Cubism, on the other hand, speaks about geometry and speaks about the freezing of the objects, literally freezing of it into the geometry of the planes that climb up in verticals rather than go deep into the plane of the picture. So here was again one of this very strong denial of the conventional, of the traditional perspectival system of illusion in a picture, whereby things elusively became lifelike. There's this very famous statement that it's not just Renaissance that brought in the illusion. It goes right back to the Greeks, and there is this story of the Greeks where a painter was successful if the painted berries were so lively that birds would come and pick at the painting. So that's the extent of the illusory, almost eye-fooling naturalism or realism, if you put it. So from this, if you moved on to Surrealism, the third choice that they exercise in the catalog note, here was the very significant movement that literally turned things head over heels, because Surrealism said that pictures were not to be made or not being made from the conscious existence, but from the subconscious. We have our dual identities as we live through our dreams. We live in our dreams with the complete freedom and the unrestricted freedom of what happens in our awakened state, where societal pressures force us to exercise self-control. It's within our dreams that we are completely, literally free to imagine whatever we wish to imagine, and all the suppressed notions of our awakened state resurfaced within dreams in the most unconnected and disconnected manners, giving rise to fantasy of an unbridled kind. So the Surrealists asked the question of why couldn't the subconscious itself become pictures? why couldn't it actually become the painting rather than becoming the theme for painting? That's a different story altogether. But the choice of these three French movements, Impressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, are enough to indicate that the collective, despite the reference to the famine and the pestilence and the heartlessness, wasn't political activism of any sort, but rather formal liberation of the language of visual expression from the dominant and the academic. Sorry, I'll come to that later on. So, as a part of this collective, Gopal Ghosh must be seen as sharing the ideals and participating in the collective ambition, but it must also be useful to perceive his efforts as transiting through the Calcutta group experience from a prior personal proclivity to a later modified practice. It is this as the background that will perhaps help us to comprehend Gopal Ghosh as an individual artist vis-a-vis Calcutta group as a collective. So Gopal Ghosh's efforts with the visual may be traced from the surviving works of the 1930s, well before the Calcutta group formed itself in 1943, the decade when he was a student, imbibing the rudimentary elements of visual articulation. The drawings and watercolors from this phase are evidence of the careful training and diligence to which the artist subjected himself. Such studies, marking an effort to imbibe the rigor and discipline in rendering the observed, form part of the usual repertoire of any young apprentice eager to engage with the academic in an effort to hone his skills. Please note that Gopal Ghosh is literally beginning with what we call European academic naturalism or realism, in terms of trying to understand what is it that makes a mark of the pencil on paper and joins that first mark with the second and the subsequent, so that an image forms and the image speaks to a viewer who is attuned to it in terms of how to read those marks as a connecting rhythm of realism. So that's the entire process of viewing. If we can really think about that pictures become real or not real depending on the kind of experience that an individual has actually passed through. In a kind of tongue-in-cheek manner, I hope some of you know, some of you may not, so I'm going to mention this here. There's this art historian called Ernst Gombrich, who had referred to how photographs in black and white had appeared to be incomprehensible to African Aboriginal tribes. Now, there's a certain nasty feeling about this also, by the way in which you isolate a certain group of people. But it's also true that there's a level of truth in it whereby it speaks about the familiarity of realism as a way of organizing scratches and marks and pigments onto a flat surface, whereby our habitual response to that flat surface refuses to remain as flat and speaks to us in terms of coordinated, perspectival, illusory whole. So this is the rationale of the realism or the naturalism that Gopal Ghosh is trying to develop himself into, trying to become familiar with as he moved ahead from this to things like these in watercolor and in thicker paint. So what followed thereafter is honing of the skills during the 30s and things like these. Imagine a perfectly classical pillared structure of an architecture out in the wilderness somewhere where you find perfectly Indian women washing clothes in a rivulet in front. So from here to things like these, we then move on through images of the 30s to the images of the 40s. What followed thereafter in the decade of the 40s constitutes a chromatic and calligraphic eruption that is reminiscent of the Fauvist and expressionist exuberance in color from the European tradition. Fauvism and expressionism are two movements in the European tradition, which are classified as modern because they had wonderful ruptures with the past, which is traditional. Fauvism looked at color and the riotous use of color for the sake of color, in the process of which they came up with very expressionistic urgency. German expressionism moved from the other way around to the same logic. For them, utterance was of priority and prominence, to do which a liberation of color was imperative. You couldn't do it without liberating color. So what Gopal Ghosh does around the 40s is probably also connected with his discovery of the early modern in the European tradition from the French Fauvists and the German expressionists, which caused these riotous colors and brilliant flurry of strokes of the brush to actually animate the surface of the paper or the canvas on which he is painting. So it is here that the inner stirrings sought a voice through paint and brushstrokes. The casting aside of the academic continues in the subsequent decades as well. So let's look through some more images of the 40s to be able to realize how what he was doing in the 30s was rigidly academic realism, and what he's trying to do now is a gleefully liberated modernism, whereby the brush is allowed to move free, the colors are allowed to be as brilliant as they wish to be, unmodulated by the grace. So they speak in the purity of their tones, and they speak with a certain gusto of their occurrence on the sheet of paper, by which they are unrestricted in terms of their violent volcanic eruption of colors and the chromatic. It is this 40s that we usually associate with Gopal Ghosh, which is simultaneously connected with the rippling lyrical characteristic of the calligraphic, which you see on the left-hand side painting, but you see it even more because it is monochrome on the right-hand side drawing. And it is here that one will also have to try and stop and think whether the usual association of the word calligraphic with the tradition of Far East, by which we mean China and Japan, has anything to do with Gopal Ghosh's transformation in the 40s. If it does, then we are looking at a very wonderful transition, because the Chinese-Japanese tradition was strongly behind the Bengal school, and it was very prominently present in the wash painting of Abanindranath, and then subsequently in whatever the students of Nandalal did, especially Vinod Bihari Mukherjee, where this man formulated a vocabulary of elements in terms of the vocabulary of strokes of the brush, not imitating Chinese brush strokes, not following the mustard seed manual, but formulating his own brush strokes corresponding to his observed natural phenomena of trees and plants and leaves and their clumps as you saw around them. We will not be looking at Vinod Bihari's paintings today in the slideshow and not be mentioning him beyond this point, because we would like to focus on what was suggested to me initially, to have a good look at Gopal Ghosh and at Calcutta Group and try and think about what it means to be suspended between tradition and modernity and resolving that suspension. So as we move forward, we come to this painting. And when you look at this painting, I hope the pictures are visible on screen. I wouldn't like to go on referring to pictures that are not visible.
স্যার একদম পরিষ্কার দেখা যায়।
Thank you, thank you. So this is a painting that Gopal Ghosh did in 1943, precisely 1943. It's evident because of the signature and the date. And he did this in what we traditionally call wash painting, the same technique that was evolved by Abanindranath Tagore. And you will realize that by using that technique, he's not just using a medium of opaque water-based pigments, but he's also conforming to a certain affected expression in the figures, in the figuration itself and the grouping, and the way in which famine as a theme has been reduced to a hilarious ridicule, if I may put it this way, because no one feels the pathos from these figures. Even when you look at the only vegetation is thorny cacti in the right hand upper corner, and if you look carefully, you will see that there is the slight existence of a dead body, almost becoming a skeleton in the lower right. So all of these speak about Gopal Ghosh trying to negotiate the language of painting. If painting has a language, or many languages for that matter, if the language is contingent on how you use colors as part of the vocabulary, how you use lines as part of the vocabulary, how you think of the pictorial space on the sheet of the paper as marked out by objects and the background, and how we put all of them together so that they're strung together like a garland and is left for the viewer to sort of dawn on and make sense out of it, then that is communication. If pictures, paintings, if visuals conform to visual communication, then how they communicate when we are looking at paintings is something that we need to really think about. And it is this that will make Gopal Ghosh move from this particular painting to this particular painting in the same decade of the 40s, an early 40s to a later 40s. If you look at the date inscribed on the lower right of the painting, you'll see that it's in October 1948. In fact, it's a decade. It's a later part of the decade of the 40s. What has he painted here? What is Gopal Ghosh trying to do? Is it a tree? Is it a natural form? Is it a geometric abstraction? If it is an abstraction from what? Does he want us to identify it with anything specific at all? Or does he want to leave it at the amorphous open stage of interpretation where it could be this and that rather than this, not that? So when we look at images that are non-specific in terms of their identification, this is the potential of the non-objective, non-representative to be able to open up to multiples in terms of their interpretation. So reading such an image would be dealing with the same components of the line and the color and the shape and the form and the space, but how they come together and what they imply would be radically different from realism. See, as you move forward, as you move from the decade of the 40s onwards, the casting aside of the academic continues in the subsequent decades. It is during this period that we find him drawing Matisse-like nudes. We should see them if I have them on the slideshow. But it is here that if you pause and think of this as the 1950s, and if you look back at what he has been doing in the 1940s, even the calligraphic swirl of the brush takes on a more earthbound, more grave volume and weight in this case. It's not as flurry as it used to be in the 40s, but now it has become more rooted and more heavier in the 50s. And that heaviness continues in landscape that he painted in pastels, one of his most favored medium, and how he built up the body of pigment, the thick body of pigment onto the small drawing exercise books, went on sort of layering in more and more strokes of the pigment from the pastel sticks, so that you built up a thickly painted, very opaque, very dense painting, and the denseness of the painting in its literal rendering is then transmitted into the denseness of the picture in terms of its potential for the visual image. There is no escape from this inescapable transition between medium and its potential for the image. So as this kept on happening, the pictures gained in a more solid staticity, solid stability, but then you had a more diverse range in the 50s, because he was also dealing with themes like the still life, especially with flowers, or the portraits, whereby the same use of corporeal thickness of pigment laid out with the similar kind of relish onto the sheet of paper was changing how we look at pictures in terms of faces. Continued into the 60s, there is again a transition where the pigment becomes thinner, pictures become more open, and they become more transparent, so that you're allowed to sort of breathe in. The heavier 50s have given way to a more lighter, more breathable 60s. I'm not making a kind of a plea for a easy resolution of decade 2 kind of pictures, but this is observable in at least some of the pictures by which one can chart the transition within the individual trajectory of the artist. As you keep on charting, you will find that the specificity of objects is gradually lost by the time you reach the 1970s. So that's taking on a more, if you may put it, Is it ominous? Because the blues have increased, the blacks have increased, the images have the image potential of darkness, not only in the question of light and dark, as in literal impinging illumination, but the darkness of the content, the darkness of the theme that is being painted. And then, even where the darkness is in blue or black, one gradually senses a kind of disquiet in the 1970s in the way that the brush moves on the sheet of paper, in the way that resolution is left open, in the way that the cragginess of the mountain peaks and the almost devoured shape of the sun in the sky, in a sky that is almost steel solid in its gray, by the strokes that develop the kind of grayish planes onto the sky, you are looking at a different Gopal Ghosh altogether. And as you look at this different Gopal Ghosh, I am asking you to try and think of an artist who is not to be straitjacketed into a singular identity of Gopal Ghosh being wonderful landscapes, beautiful colors, and the flourish of the calligraphic sweetness of rhythm. There could be a Gopal Ghosh who is dark. There could be a Gopal Ghosh who is actually literally struggling with himself and struggling with painting to come up in the subsequent decades with images that do not give us peace, that refuse to give us a peaceful resolution of an image, a pictorial image that we can keep on looking at and admire and find solace in, as if we could frame that and hang that onto the wall. If one were to frame a painting like this and hang it up to the wall in one's dining room or in the drawing room of an interior, they would refuse to provide the kind of sweet rhythm that the 1930s and 40s did. And they would definitely come back with a kind of a powerful backlash that gives us a kind of a disquieting feeling. So if we could have a recap and return to a select few images, the recap would be something like this. Early images, calligraphic sweet flourish and rhythm of a very, very, very softer kind. Early paintings leading on to later paintings, even within the same decade, where what you find on the right-hand side is probably sweeter than the more riotous, almost flaming landscape on the left. And then from landscapes to cityscapes, and from cityscapes to interiors. So looking from the inside to the outside, and you have a lone woman standing there, as if it's a literal translation of the home and the world, Ghore Baire. And then from there, onto images that defy classification. What kind of an artist are we looking at if we are thinking of Gopal Ghosh and landscapes? What kind of an artist could be represented by these images? Obviously, what we're seeing on screen right now is more akin to and more attuned to the French modernist trends of Faubist directions. Also thematically close to probably Impressionist paintings, but it is also in the 1946 that a sketchbook came up during my quest for documentation, which was these pages. And the sketchbook began with the painting in color at the top left. And I was thinking that probably I'm looking at, I had not noticed the date 1946. I thought I was looking at famine, because you have skeletons strewn all over the ground with a dark, pitch black, tar-coated road running right through, and then continuing into this fiery red of something that should be a sky, but could be anything for that matter, and vegetation that is just upright browns without any leaves. And you find this swarm of vultures that have descended onto these decaying bodies to devour that last morsel of flesh, leaving the white of the bones glistening bare on the very dry and dull green of the ground. As I turned over the pages of this sketchbook, I found that there were more disquieting images to follow. What seemed like a woman lying on the ground on the lower left corner, an interior that is composed of the artist's tools of the trade and a model that's lying on the ground, probably. Once you saw this picture along with the rest of the paintings or the drawings, and once you realize right up to the lower right corner that there is a painting of a woman lying on the ground while there is a marked out territory of the inside and the outside, and there is this fire burning outside while there's a mob that rushes forward with sticks in their hands. It's actually literally 1946, and Gopal Ghosh couldn't resist but draw images of the riots, the Hindu-Muslim riots that he was witnessing from his room somewhere up there. Now, if you look at the same sketchbook, and if you look at the top right image that we have on the screen, that which appears to be something like an architecture, a house with flying curtains or maybe cloth laid out to dry in the sun, you'd realize that this is not so peaceful, despite the plantain leaves in the foreground and the brick and mortar wall that runs right through. Because then you have to go deep in and look at what is depicted in the background, in the distance, and there are armored tanks rushing down between the two fields. And on the fields, it's not cultivation; it's just dead bodies strewn all over. So here is a very disquieting Gopal Ghosh, a Gopal Ghosh who did observe and respond to the immediacy of his surroundings, and then he transited from the literal and the descriptive to the metaphoric. So here are stick figures on the ground, but they are stick figures whom you don't really initially associate with riots and death, not until and unless you see the red in the background, not until and unless you see that even a tree, which should have been firmly grounded by its roots on the ground, has almost levitated up, and it's almost a flaming tree against that enormity of the dark black against which it is framed. And then you have a tree, which is probably a tree, but is also something like a bomb blast, almost like the mushroom cloud that you have when you have a bomb being dropped. It's almost like the Hiroshima experience. You literally have a bleeding center where the brilliant vermilion is allowed to bleed into the green, and the green then disappears. The green is literally a silhouette. It's just flat. It doesn't have a dimension. And as a silhouette, it appears against the dark black marks of the background. It's a world which is notoriously dark, almost like our nightmares. From these nightmares, you have these peeping eyes behind trees, and then the eye itself becomes something like a close-up, and then Gopal Ghosh, whom we would never have imagined to actually become an abstract painter, in the 40s turns to pictures like this. From there onto a picture like this, where you have a very energetically executed rapid brushstrokes onto the ground, where it could be anything. It could be trees, it could be a flock of birds, it could be anything. It's left wide open to interpretation. But certain pictures are not left wide open to interpretation. This is certainly his response to the burning flames during the riots. You actually see a mob in the foreground without literally painting the mob in terms of identifiable human figures. And then you have the houses up in flames. And you have people in front who are shooting. Therefore, the military, the police, the burning houses, the dead men and women, and the enormous desolation. The fire that engulfs our beings, the fire that engulfs vehicles on the street, torched by rioting multitude. Is this the Gopal Ghosh that we know? Is this the Gopal Ghosh that we now put up the question of how to situate him against those three terms of tradition, the modern, and the international? Could we see him borrowing from languages, if we can use the word borrowing, from a larger tradition? Much more closer home for me, because I live in Shantiniketan 24/7, 365 days of the year. I am constantly made aware of this very philosophical speculation about the world in a nest, because our motto is this, Yatra Vishwa Bhavatyeka Neram, where the entire world comes to roost as in a single nest. That was Rabindranath's idea of the brilliance of humanity being brotherhood. No discrepancy, no difference. And he was uttering this in a certain time when his own country was literally battling against oppressive foreign forces. There were many who didn't like him because he's saying things against the grain. The 3 essays that he wrote on nationalism were not very palatable then. It's neither very palatable now, because they are off the beaten track. It can only be understood by people who really, really study him incisively as a personality who was also a thinking person, who thought. And as he thought, he wrote. And not everything he wrote is going to be very palatably to your taste. It's not going to cater to your taste. Very similarly, here is someone like Gopal Ghosh, who admired Rabindranath quite a lot. Here is Gopal Ghosh, who I believe when he began his tour of India on a bicycle, Rabindranath sent him a one-liner as a good wish. So here are these connections that we must carefully try and notice. But here is a Gopal Ghosh who cannot restrain himself from painting those burning vehicles on his beloved city streets. Torched away, who dies, what is burnt up is a larger financial, economic, philosophical question. But for him, it is this dangerous side of destruction that now takes on the nature of the calligraphic yellow lines. It's no longer at peace, it's no longer at harmony, it's rather the disharmonious and the disjunct that becomes the Gopal Ghosh language. From there, if you could go on to things like this, again, another torched vehicle. These are the famine drawings from Gopal Ghosh on the left. And on the right hand is a comparable drawing by another artist called Indra.
মিউট করুন।
এই সাউন্ডটাকে মিউট করতে হবে।
The sound very, very strategically is a wonderful sound at this stage.
Okay. Who is this lady?
কে সুজাতা?
Anyway, I'll try and continue beyond the sound. It's the same period in which we find the publication called Bengal Painters' Testimony, brought out by the All India Students Federation, which had drawings by several artists who did not always paint the famine, did not always paint suffering, and even when they did, it's in a wide-ranging linguistic discrepancy between the Gopal Ghosh formal modernism on the left-hand side that you see to the affected Bengal school mannerism from Indadugar at the top right to the absolutely social realist Chitta Prasad on the lower right of the screen at the moment. So Bengal Painters' Testimony was a wonderful document that put together how the contemporary artist came together in a single voice to produce an album of pictures that could then generate money for the famine-inflicted and the people who were suffering thereafter. Published in 1943, this is the companion piece to what Chitta Prasad came up in terms of Hungry Bengal, which is his record, the diary that he wrote in pictures and text of his tour through Midnapur district, observing famine at its worst. From there, we then move on to something else. We shall come to this. Let me first read out the last couple of paragraphs that I've written down for all of you, because I'm referring to Porizo Sen, who in 1976, his recollections of the collective called Calcutta Group justifiably identified how the urban experience marked the distinction of a landscape as a genre in the artists of the Calcutta Group, including most prominently Gopal Ghosh, from that of the tradition in rural Shantiniketan. He writes, quote, "To sum it up, the establishment of the industrial civilization had conspicuously left its mark upon art practice," and he was referring to the artists of his collective. He traced the formal connections to the familiarity with Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art, as well as the flood of colors in Fauvism and the closer-at-home impact of Jamini Roy's revolutionary shift. Distinguishing Gopal Ghosh from Vinod Bihari Mukherjee, Sen acknowledged the achievement of pure landscape in the latter, but rejoiced in the fact that Gopal Ghosh's efforts marked a, quote, contemporary landscape image, unquote. This is an articulation of the tradition-modernity polarity, persisting 3 decades after the collective was active. But there is a grain of truth to discover beyond the proclamation of one against the other. As a painter hailing from a non-rural ambience, unlike the pristine location of Shantiniketan, which Vinod Bihari has been mapped onto, Gopal Ghosh's efforts with the landscape may indeed be perceived in terms of that urge towards nature, that is unlike the lived experience of having existed in regular communion with nature. There is this distinct desire for nature marked by the palette and the urgency and the passion in the calligraphy that define the forms and the pictorial space, which is markedly different from a more introspective realization that one can achieve through communion in the location that is relatively rural. If you can look through these opposing characteristics and defining terminology, probably the Vinod Bihari Mukherjee Gopal Ghosh duality of landscape perceived differently, landscape painted differently with a different intent can be comprehended. Now, we all know that the tradition of landscape painting in the West can be traced in its evolution of the implications of Roman murals. We know how Romans used landscape on their walls of the interiors to break open the claustrophobia of small spaces into wide open spaces illusionistically, leading on to several other phases through the Renaissance and the Baroque and the Neoclassical and the Romantic, right up to the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist artists. On the other hand, there is an alternative tradition of, I'm not saying that we stop at Post-Impressionism. Certainly there are Fauvist landscapes, Expressionist landscapes, and there are landscapes that run right through the entire period of the modernist, surrealist landscapes for that matter, up to the postmodern stage, which is beyond the modern. We are not going to complicate this with how postmodernism and post-structuralism are tied to each other. That's a different story that can be taken up some other time on some other occasion. But for us today, since we're looking at this, the 3 words of tradition, modernity, and internationalism, with reference to Gopal Ghosh, he becomes a wonderful case study from the backdrop of the urban location of Calcutta. So neither of these 2 directions necessarily explain, neither of the 2 directions of the Western tradition, nor of the Chinese landscape tradition, which is marked by this wonderful word called shanshui, which is mountain water, and it refers to a more literal approach of the experience of the natural vista converted into the linguistic notions of the graphic impingement of marks of the brush, very strictly codified that this sort of mark represents mountains and rocks, and that sort of mark translates into clouds and cascading waterfalls, etc. So Gopal Ghosh is neither of the 2. He does have a certain element that can be identified with the Chinese fluency of the brushstroke and its calligraphic flourish, but that's about it. There is nothing of the Taoist philosophy. There is nothing of the Chinese philosophical content in his paintings. Rather, there is nothing of the European idea either. This is a purely Indian artist caught up in the dynamics and the dilemma of an Indian modern and trying to define himself vis-a-vis his precariousness of existing in a third world situation where it is caught between these odds, caught between the crossfire of what he can hail as tradition. So it is here that neither of these two directions necessarily explain Gopal Ghosh entirely, nor is any one of them exclusive to his efforts to paint a landscape, but the subliminal synthesis of all impulses led on to a distinctly personal meditation on the possibilities of the genre. By the 1970s, the inward gaze has crystallized further. The local specificity of whatever degree that may have been identified in his earlier work has given way to an increasingly visionary statement. His tour in the 1930s must have provided him with the experience of the wide range of what constitutes nature in this country. In his mature work of the later decades of his life, it would purely be unjust to explain his landscapes merely in terms of the fleeing the city anti-urban impulse. It would be pertinent in this regard to recall that the poet Rabindranath Tagore wrote to the artist in a letter dated 1937, quote, "You have set out to view India through the eyes of an artist. I pray and hope that the intention finds due fruition through the painter's image," unquote. Coming from a perceptive individual like the poet who had himself explored landscapes extensively in his entire career, this little statement of encouragement, nearly a benediction of sorts, must have provided Gopal Ghosh with an enormous support. As in his landscapes, so too in his flower and fruit paintings, the image travels well beyond the literal and the retinal observation and becomes the opportunity to explore transformation and transmutations of the arranged objects in a wider concern with how his bird forms shift from the literal in the decade of the 50s to the more generic 2 decades later forms a parallel linked narrative of transformation through his efforts with the landscapes. Despite the predominance of the motifs from nature, Gopal Ghosh did also paint the human figure and portraits, which we have seen a couple of them. But from now on, we shall leave all of these descriptions behind, and without prolonging a presentation too long, because my own classroom exercise has actually told me, and all of you being faculty members do know, that the attention span for a lecture is limited to 45 minutes at the most. We have already probably gone beyond that time. So from 45 minutes to 1 hour, that's our usual attention span, beyond which we fidget. We create marks on the sheets of paper, on notebooks that we have in front of us without really thinking of it. Those are those subconscious scratches that we keep on making a la surrealism. So however, in an attempt to release my presentation to Gopal Ghosh only, I wish to introduce as counterpoint here a set of visual images from other artists who preceded him, and I had mentioned them earlier in the introductory part of it, so that we can perhaps form a more comprehensive notion about pictorial language and its evolution over the years and the decades, as well as map the subtly changing notion of the modern vis-a-vis the ideas of the national against the international, the local against the global, being a much larger and distinctly different dimension in much more recent times. The first of the visuals I want to share with you for collective enjoyment is this. It should be known to many of you, but if you do not know, this is a published version of a manuscript from Abanindranath Tagore called Khuddur Jatra. It's a work that he did between 1934-35 and 1942. It's a manuscript of a play based on Ramayana, but again twisted around like a tongue twister, played around with ideas and plays on words where there are layers of meanings beyond the surface here. So here it is that the manuscript of a play we wrote for children titled Khuddur Jatra. It has some other names also. It's called Khudiram Lila. So Khudiram simultaneously indicating a character in the play and also indicating the smallness, Khudi, Khudra. So we must be cautious of even straitjacketing Abanindranath Tagore, because what the pages of the manuscript look like are these. Obviously, this was not meant for public viewing. A manuscript is a very private object. Very few people actually got to see what was being done. And one of the persons who actually saw it and wrote at some length about it is poet Jasimuddin, who wrote how he had observed Abanindranath in a frenzy in a room where it was scattered about with torn sheets of paper and sweet wrappers and whatnot all over the place, and he's going around hunting for the correct piece of object to be picked up and pasted onto his manuscript, so that it becomes an ideal visual. Mark my word, visual, not an illustration, because the visuals are playing a double fiddle, as we say in English, a twin fiddle as it goes on, so that they are not literally illustrations, but they play a second tune to the Ramayana and do it in a very wonderfully tongue-in-cheek way. So how you would like to see the fire burning when the demons alight in a certain place can be literally represented by a cutout piece of paper that says Dante's Inferno. You could literally have the entire space of those fabulous lands that Sita and Ravan crossed over, indicated by all those that you see. So if there is a chariot that carries Ram from the palace to the wilderness, then there has to be a chariot somewhere. And if you can't find a chariot, you at least have the spire of a temple representing the chariot on the upper left. But then when Bharat has to return back with the Paduka, what else comes to represent the Paduka than the advertisement for shoes? So you have Radhu and Company, one of the remarkable shoe sellers of the day. And then just adjacent to it, Abhinav makes sure that he cuts out from some of the disparate sources the words religious faith, that driving force, as printed typed words in English, that he inserts into the illustration, in the quote-unquote pasted picture illustration. So here it is that present day, absolutely anachronistically present day shoes are being used as stand-ins for visuals that refer to the Ramayana. So here you have the page representing Surpanakha, and Surpanakha in this case is a uncouth, dark, I know there is a colorism involved, but let's at least forget the more contemporary criticisms and look at the image for its potential, because on top of it is the caption which says "Churi koreo makte icche kore." It's literally taken from an advertisement for cosmetics, but it uses the reverse of it, so that someone who is dark, someone who is ugly, can put on cosmetics to literally become beautiful. That's the catchword. That's the catch line. So it's with this that Surpanakha is being represented. If you read the words right beneath the picture, the pasted piece of paper, it's written Surpanakha Nashakartan. So the cutting off of the nose of Surpanakha. From there it goes on, and the manuscript is a lovely piece of work, because there is his master's voice, you can see on the lower sheet, but as you turn over the pages, you not only have his master's voice, you also have the watches of the contemporary times. As you turn over, you have, and probably we should close it back again, let's not look at it further. So here is Ravan who is coming to carry Sita away, and what better than have a cinema poster of a valiant hero on a horseback. Now we don't find any version of Raman saying that Ravan came on horseback. But here is Abhinav Thakur, who can very freely use such almost licentious objects to represent Rama. What could be a representation of Jatayu? You cut out some photograph of some other object. It's only the contour line that represents the profile of a bird that stands in and for Jatayu. And on the left you read Jatayu Pravesh. So in the play, Jatayu comes in onto the stage. But what is there present in the image is radically different, because it's probably an interior, or it's probably something to do with furnitures. I don't know what, but you can only get to see one small clip of it. You only notice that it is not a bird. And as you see this duality between the contour of a bird and the interior, which is not a bird, and you realize what is Abhinav trying to do. He is well ahead of his times between the 30s and the 40s, because collage of this kind would have been unthinkable in India of the day. Collage of this kind would also be unthinkable, where something taken from some other source is sufficiently transmuted to indicate Lanka, because if Lanka is that weird place where magic happens, then probably this is it. Science fiction is Lanka. And if you have to visit Lanka, which is for the first time you're seeing colors, chromatic objects, for example, the colored image on the right hand side, or the colored sunset on the left hand side. If Lanka is so fabulous, then to reach Lanka, which is also closed behind closed doors, and to try and see if you can look at Sita, held behind closed doors, because you're looking for it, like Hanuman. So you open the doors, which can literally be opened because they are stuck on pieces of paper, and then you find things that you did not expect to find. So you quickly close it back again and say, what's behind closed doors better be closed. So as you go on, you find that dances of all kinds and dances of all kinds, they come to stand in for the cherries in Ravana's Ashokvan. And they dance that weird dance, including Kathakali. And then you have things from Praswaru's relief, representing uprisings, to the more contemporary World War symbols from Germany, all indicating the Ramayana war between Ram and Ravan as between good and the evil. And to be able to understand what kind of evil it is, you have to look at Kabandha, the demon who did not have a neck because his head was stuck to the shoulders. And here is literally a collage, because in place of the teeth, Abhayat cuts out the words TWTH from some text somewhere and pastes them on, and then right beneath it he writes in verticals, warning. This is something which is not very pleasurable. You should better be warned about the demon who is right in front of you. So you turn over the pages and you find that when Ravan is carrying Sita away, all that Sita has to do is to drop her ornaments so that the path can be traced. And what better way to represent ornaments, like the advertisements of shows for Bharata is carrying away of the Paduka. Here is the advertisements for ornaments, or the example books for the jewelers that stand in. Here is Trijata, one of the demons, again a collage. But what's interesting and more fascinating is how could Hanuman cross over the ocean unless and until there is an airport? So a new airport is necessary. You do have aircrafts also on the left-hand side, indicating that portion of the narrative that is standing in for Hanuman crossing over from this end of the bank to the island of Lanka. And when you have crossed over, when Rama has crossed over and has had something like the battle being won, you have the road to glory. And when you have the road to glory, then Ram, Sita, and you have, oh my God, who are represented beneath? You do have Shakalebal and Ram, Sita, but beneath it, he makes it clear that the picture represents Ravan and Mandodari. And they are cut out from some kind of a Shakespearean play. So you have this constant switch between identities. And as the constant switch between identities goes on, Ravan Umandodari Pravesh, you end the manuscript with Sita in the, she has been abandoned by Ram and she's in the hermitage. So the best thing to do is to show the spinning wheel of Gandhi without Gandhi himself being present. So that's how the manuscript ends. From this, we move on to the second example that we need to see to be able to understand those three words, and that is Rabindranath Tagore. And for Rabindranath, we'd like to say this one. This is the cover of the 1934 May version of the edition of Vishwa Bharati News. And it's a birthday number, obviously, because it's May. 9th of May is his birthday. And it carried a photographic representation of the portrait of Rabindranath. In a number of what we call offprints of the cover, which he fortunately had his hands on, what Rabindranath did to volume 2, number 14 of the May 1934 Vishwa Bharati News is remarkable to be observed, because he kept on scratching his own face and evolving and emerging with characters and identities which are radically different. In some, he kept the eyes intact, changed the rest of it. But the very fact that Rabindranath could actually deface his own face is a remarkable visual strategy by which he's moving through several role playings that he does Is this Rabindranath? Is it a mask? You'd stop and ask the question because you can see the eyes through the mask. And what has happened here is that Rabindranath is absent, entirely absent, and it's almost a female face. So here is again the whole question of what Rabindranath believes to be identity questions. Identity even in the, probably the gendered identity question. Probably why I have a great fascination to keep this picture on, and I tell my students in class that think about how a poet and a novelist could write in the first person and say, Ami Bimola in one of the sections of Ghore Baire. So if the poet can think of himself as in a feminine identity, it's very easy for him to actually scratch over one of his faces and transform its even gendered identity and make it into a female portrait. Some that leave the eyes open, some that do not leave the eyes open, but this is what it did to his photographic portrait. So a remarkable transition, not in terms of the landscape, but in terms of the portrait and in terms of the self-portrait being defaced from what we think to be absolute likeness because it's a photograph, because it's mechanically generated, into a mechanical portrait which is mechanically generated, being scribbled over manually in an effort to transform one face into many faces, one identity into many identities. From there on to Nandalal Bose, who painted very, very conventional landscapes like this in his early stages. I say conventional because they are almost like jigsaw puzzles. You can't remove a tree or a mountain or any part of this painting without hampering the entire picture in terms of its precisely calculated balance. They fit in like jigsaw puzzles. The edges fit in, the corners fit in. You can't just remove any single part of it. This Nandalal, in a much more later date, would be going through such jigsaws, transforming into this. This is 1960s Nandalal. And in the 60s, much like the painting that we saw from Gopal Ghosh, here is a Nandalal who has moved beyond himself, moved into the terrain of the absolutes. And the absolutes, almost as if they are ringing the same bell like, say, Paul Cézanne, in whose landscapes he just held it back from becoming completely non-objective. If you look at Cézanne's watercolors, you'll know what I'm talking about. So here it is that any of these pictures that you see on screen, or say this one and this one, they could be anything. Once again, the one on the lower right, it could be a flock of birds, it could be a field full of crops swaying in the breeze, it could be anything. It's to this extent that Nandalal, a person whom we have identified from the beginning, say from Parthasarathi, a painting like Parthasarathi, right through Haripura posters to the later pictures. This is where he has reached in the 60s. Absolute, complete, universal abstraction. Look at a person like Jamini Roy, and look at how he can completely transform the identity of one religion into another religion. How the domestication of the gods plays around such that it's so infinitely easy now to grasp Mary, Jesus, and Joseph, because they echo the formal compositional pattern of Ganesh Janani along with Shiva. The only difference being that what is an ass in the first case is the lion or the tiger in the second case. So it's here that compositional strategies bring things closer home. And as it brings things closer home, Jamini Roy's Christs are not just Christ. They will remind you of those red painted palm of icons like Chaitanya and Nityananda in the more closer to home context. So the cross behind Christ disappears. He just becomes upraised arm, some divine figure, almost in a gesture of benediction, blessing you rather than screaming in pain. What he has done is something like this. He has moved in stages, one from the other and to the next, in terms of defining the modern as moving away and away and away from the local and the national into the absoluteness of the international. Even someone like Jamini Roy, who is known to have been famed for being so close to the Potua tradition, if you look really close at his pictures, those pictures that we would rather not like to bring into the discussion because it complicates things, it shows us a very different Jamini Roy. This is a predictable Jamini Roy. This is a not so predictable Jamini Roy. And from these not so predictable Jamini Roys, if you move further ahead, you will find that you'll see pictures where you can't even define them properly. And as you find it difficult to define, you range from, say, an unknown iconography of Garud himself being the mount of Vishnu, himself riding on a horse. This is an invented iconography. It never existed in the tradition. So the entire idea of tradition and modernity is being played out in pictures where we may not be noticing it very carefully. And because we don't notice, here is a Jamini Roy whom we should take note of. The Jamini Roy not of the paintings, but the Jamini Roy of the drawings. And it is here that the modernist in Jamini Roy is in its most acutely powerful expression, most vociferous in its existence. So with this, I would like to end this slideshow. That last floating figure from Jamini Roy on the lower right of the screen should be an ideal image to close this discussion. And as we close this discussion, let me read out to you just one sentence, not even a sentence, a phrase. It's from a book by an author called Donald Preziosi. And Donald Preziosi is an art historian who wrote a lovely book called The Art of Art History. Not the history of art history, it's the art of art history. And in that, the foreword or the prefatory essay has a caption saying, art history, there's a colon, and it says, making the visible legible. We come back to the question of language. What is visible can be read because it is legible. What is legible is constructed of alphabets and words and phrases and sentences and paragraphs and chapters. That's what is legible. You read words, you pick up a piece of paper and you read through them. When do pictures and sculptures and designs and pottery become legible? When you think of them as languages that can be decoded from the coded form in which it is presented to us. So believing wholeheartedly in the fact that art history is a discipline that makes the visible legible, all I'm trying to say is that, like all languages that operate within and based on relationships of the parts to the whole, it is the idea of the totality. Visual images may be similarly expected to be the parts that convey an idea of their totality, the wholeness of it. Once we lend ourselves to sharpen our wavelength receptors to the utterances, no doubt visual, we will most certainly find that the visual images, quote unquote, speak to us such that the visible will very easily become legible. Thank you for your patience. I'm not really sure how far this entire monologue plays a role within the overarching theme of the FDP. I'm sure people must have become awfully and terribly bored and left the
না স্যার,
virtual hall.
না অসম্ভব ভালো লেগেছে, কিন্তু এখানে
It's an overdose.
না না ওভারডোজ,
না,
এখানে অনেক অনেক কিছু জানলাম। আসলে এত কিছু প্রসেস করতে একটু সময় লাগছে, তাই সবাই ঠিক করে গেছে। তো
দেবায়ন আছো তো?
হ্যাঁ দিদি আছি।
আমি এটুকুই বলতে পারি যে আমি নিজেও জানি যে এত তাড়াতাড়ি রেসপন্ড করা যায় না। I don't really expect and rather would not expect questions that need to be asked because you need to ask questions. I would be more than happy that my email is shared amongst all, so that if you do really have observations, questions, doubts, clarifications, please feel free to write to me, and please rest assured that I'm going to respond back. I always do. I may not be responding to calls, I may not be responding to text messages, but I definitely respond to emails.
ঠিক আছে স্যার। আমার মনে হয় দেবায়ন কিছু বলবে, তারপরে কোয়েশ্চেন্স গুলো বোধহয় আসবে।
আমরা কি স্যার প্রথমে কিছু কোয়েশ্চেন্স নিয়ে নেবো যদি কিছু
হ্যাঁ,
থাকে?
নিশ্চয়ই।
স্যার একটা কাটআউটে একটা মেসেজ এসেছে নবনীতা মিত্র, উনি লিখছেন, স্যার why did the Calcutta school ebb away by the 1953?
হ্যাঁ, এর অনেকগুলো কারণ আছে। তার মধ্যে একটা কারণ তখনই বোঝা যাবে যখন 1953 কে একটা দশক হিসেবে, একটা সাল হিসেবে, সন তারিখের নিরিখে আমরা একটু বিচার করে দেখব তার সোশ্যাল, ইকোনমিক, পলিটিক্যাল হিস্ট্রির পরিপ্রেক্ষিতে। যখন ক্যালকাটার যা উদ্দেশ্য ছিল, সেই উদ্দেশ্যটাকে আর সেই একইভাবে টেনে নিয়ে যাওয়া সম্ভব ছিল কি ছিল না, সেইটা একটা প্রশ্ন হতে পারে। দ্বিতীয় প্রশ্ন এটাই যে সমষ্টি সমানেই ওই কামিং টুগেদার এন্ড ডিসিপেশনের মধ্যে দিয়ে গড়ে উঠেছে, যার কোনো কনস্ট্যান্সি নেই ইন টার্মস অফ মেম্বারশিপ অ্যান্ড দেয়ার ফর দি এফার্ট। আমরা যদি ভেবে দেখি যে এই বিদেশি আর্ট মুভমেন্ট গুলো ঠিক কিভাবে হয়ে থাকে, কিউবিজম বললে আমরা মনে করি পিকাসো, ব্রাক, ইওয়ান গ্রিস, এর বাইরে তো আর ভাবি না। এর বাইরেও একটা কিউবিজম আছে, এর বাইরেও কিউবিজম ছিল, একাধিক কিউবিজম, যেখানেতে যে সেন্ট্রাল কিউবিস্ট প্রিন্সিপাল সেটা অন্যান্য শিল্পীদের মধ্যে ছড়িয়ে গিয়েছিল, পারকোলেট করেছিল। তো এইভাবে যদি দেখতে থাকি তাহলে দেখবো এই অর্থে আমাদের দেশে কোনো আর্ট মুভমেন্ট, আই এম ইউজিং দ্য ওয়ার্ড মুভমেন্ট, হয়নি। হবার মতো তার ঐতিহাসিক প্রেক্ষাপট এবং ভূমি তৈরি ছিল না, আজও হয়তো নেই। কারণ যে শব্দটাকে খুব সজাগভাবে আর্টিস্টোরিয়ানরা ব্যবহার করেন, আমার একটু ব্যবহার করতে ভয় হয়, সেটা যুদ্ধের কনটেক্সট থেকে আসে। অনেকেই বলেন যে ডু উই হ্যাভ অ্যান avant-garde ইন আওয়ার কান্ট্রি, এন্ড ইফ ইউ ডোন্ট, দেন দ্যাট ইজ ওয়ান অফ দ্য রিজনস ওয়াই উই ডোন্ট হ্যাভ দি মডার্ন। এবং সেই জন্যেই গীতা কাপুরের মতো আর্ট হিস্টোরিয়ান বলেন যে উই হ্যাভ মুভড ইনটু দ্য পোস্ট মডার্ন উইথ অ্যান ইনকমপ্লিট মডার্নিটি অ্যান্ড অ্যান ইনকমপ্লিট মডার্নিজম। এইটা এত জটিল হয়ে যায় যেখান থেকে একটি গ্রুপ যেটা আর্লি মডার্ন ব্রেক নিয়ে আসার চেষ্টা করছে from what we still consider to be tradition. Bengal school is still considered to be tradition in the 40s, যেহেতু সেটা was harking back to traditional Indian painting in its essence, going back to reviving the tradition that is apparently lost and needs to be revived back. সেই বিশ্বাস থেকে যখন একটা সলিড স্ট্রেট রাপচার, একটা ক্লিভেজ করে যখন এগিয়ে যেতে পারে ভবিষ্যতের দিকে তাকিয়ে, এবং যখন এটা এতটাই কমপ্লিকেটেড হয়ে যায় যে আমি একটা বিদেশি ভাষাকে আহরণ করব কি করব না, এবং সেটা তখনই 1943 to 53, একটু ওই সময়টাকে ভেবে দেখি, আবারও 47টাকে মাথায় রেখে তার এপাশে এবং তার ওপাশে। By 1953, certain other tendencies have started emerging, which are questions on indigenism, questions on the abstraction and image making, যেখানে ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপ ঠিক যেভাবে চর্চা করতো সেই চর্চার প্রাসঙ্গিকতাটা আর নেই, যে জন্য ব্যক্তি শিল্পীর মধ্যে থেকে তাদের প্রচেষ্টা এগিয়ে গেল, কিন্তু সংঘবদ্ধ গ্রুপের মধ্যে থাকার অবস্থা রইল না। আবার এই সংঘবদ্ধ গ্রুপ হবার পরিস্থিতি গড়ে উঠবে সেটা অনেক পরের দিকে, একদম অনেক ভিন্ন একটা পরিস্থিতিতে, যখন artist groups will start forming, but forming for a very different reason altogether. Not the reason with which Calcutta group in the 1943 came together. Not with an impulse from a social circumstance that makes it imperative for young minds to come together and think of a changing pictorial language that must be the voice of the times.
অলরাইট, আর কারোর কিছু প্রশ্ন বা
আমি একটু আমি একটা প্রশ্ন করতে পারি কি করতে পারি মানে কিছু না বুঝেই প্রায় সেটা হচ্ছে যে আপনি যখন প্রথম দিকে বলছিলেন যে ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপ 1943-53 যে ফেজটা, যেখানে কো-ফাউন্ডার গোপাল ঘোষ, তো এই 53 পর যখন ধরুন গোপাল ঘোষের যে ট্রান্সফরমেশন হচ্ছে, যেটা আপনি দেখালেন 60s এর, 50s এর, 70s এর, মানে তখন তাকে মানে প্রশ্নটা একেবারেই বাচ্চা ইয়ের মতো, আমি তাও করছি, মানে তখন তাকে তিনি কি কোনো গ্রুপে আছেন? এই যে ধরুন তিনটে বেঙ্গল স্কুল অফ, আপনি যে বেঙ্গল স্কুল বললেন শান্তিনিকেতন, আচ্ছা, আর চিত্রপ্রসাদ সোমনাথর এই যে প্রথম
সেই দলে যেমন নেই, থাকতে পারছেন না, কারণ তিনি মনে প্রাণে রাজনৈতিক ব্যক্তিত্ব নন। রাজনীতি এবং ছবিকে এক করে দেখা, সেটা পলিটিক্যাল পার্টির মেম্বার হই বা না হই, চিত্তপ্রসাদ একদম হোল টাইমার ছিলেন, জয়নুল আবেদিন একেবারেই ছিলেন না, সোমনাথ ছিলেন। হ্যাঁ, চিত্তপ্রসাদ এক সময় খুব 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 তাড়াতাড়ি পার্টির সাথে তার মেম্বারশিপ ছিন্ন করেন, যেহেতু তিনি দেখলেন যে ওই পিসি যোশী সময় থেকে বিটি রানা দেবী এরাতে গিয়ে আমূল পরিবর্তন হয়ে গেল, তাদের কালচারাল প্রোগ্রামটাই বদলে যেতে থাকলো। সোমনাথের আরেকটু সময় লেগেছিল, সোমনাথের আরেকটু তরুণ প্রজন্মের, তার পক্ষে এই ডিসলিউশনমেন্ট হতে অনেক দেরি হয়েছিল, এবং যখন হলো তখন এত ভয়ানক ভাবে হয়েছিল যে সেটা একটা রেকারিং মোটিভ হিসেবে এই ফ্যামিনের শরীর, তার ড্রয়িং থেকে শুরু করে, প্রিন্ট থেকে শুরু করে শেষ অব্দি তার ব্রঞ্জ কালচার অব্দি ছড়িয়ে গিয়েছিল। মানে ওইটার বাইরে তিনি আর মানে ওটা প্রায় তার সমগ্র সত্তাকে জুড়েছিল। কিন্তু গোপাল কৃষ্ণ ঠিক সেরকম শিল্পী নন, তিনি অনেক,
সেটা বোঝাই গেল আপনি যা দেখালেন,
ফলে
ভালো করে বোঝা গেল।
ফলে তার পক্ষে একটা ভাঙা গ্রুপ থেকে আবার একটা গ্রুপে যাওয়াটাই সম্ভব হলো না। আর দুই হচ্ছে যে তখন এরকম গ্রুপ আর গড়েও উঠলো না, কারণ ততদিনেতে 50-এর দশক থেকে 60-এর দশক থেকে 70-এর দশক ছবির জগতে ভয়ঙ্কর ভাবে ইন্ডিভিজুয়ালিজমের জগৎ, মানে সময়, ব্যক্তি স্বাতন্ত্র্য তখন এতটাই চরমে যে একজন ব্যক্তি আরেকজন ব্যক্তি থেকে কতটা আলাদা হতে পারে। মডার্নিটি অ্যাজ নট বিং সাবসিউমড ইনটু লাইকনেস, আমি যতক্ষণ আমার মতো করে স্বতন্ত্র হতে পারছি ততক্ষণ আর আধুনিক কি হলাম, এই ধারণা এতটাই ছবির চর্চাকে পেয়ে বসলো যে ওই ভিন্নতাটা আর কোনো যৌথ প্রচেষ্টার অবকাশ রাখছে না।
আর বেঙ্গল স্কুল অফ শান্তিনিকেতন,
বেঙ্গল স্কুল অফ শান্তিনিকেতন নয়, বেঙ্গল স্কুলটা বেঙ্গল স্কুল, বেঙ্গল স্কুল হচ্ছে তারাই যারা প্রধানত অবনীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুরের শিষ্য, এবং অবনীন্দ্রনাথ ঘরানার ছবিকে তারা কন্টিনিউ করে নিয়ে যাচ্ছেন, আজ অব্দি করেন, এখনো আছেন, যারা মনে করেন যে ওই ম্যানারিজমটাতে ছবি আঁকাটাই হচ্ছে উৎকর্ষের শীর্ষস্থানে পৌঁছানোর উপায়। এর বাইরে আর ছবি হয় না, ছবি মানে হচ্ছে ওই গুণাগুণ, ওই রস, তার বাইরে কোনো রস নেই, তারা বিশ্বাস করতে চান না তারা। এবং আরেকটু পরবর্তীকালে নন্দলাল বসুর ছাত্রছাত্রীও যারা ওই ধারণাতে বিশ্বাস করে এগোতে চেয়েছিলেন, যদিও যেটা লক্ষণীয়, কেন আমরা বলি যে বেঙ্গল স্কুল আর শান্তিনিকেতন সমর্থক নয়, সেটা হচ্ছে এই জন্যই যে অবন ঠাকুর তার নিজের জীবন দিয়ে দেখিয়ে দিয়ে গেছেন যে প্রত্যেক মুহূর্তে কি করে নিজেকে ভেঙে গড়া যেতে পারে। যে অবন ঠাকুর থেকে বেঙ্গল স্কুল উঠে এলো, সেই অবন ঠাকুর কিন্তু শেষ অব্দি আর নিজেরই বেঙ্গল স্কুল ঘরানা ছবি আঁকলেন না। যদি তাই আঁকতেন তাহলে ওই আরব্য রজনীর পরে তিনি কিছুতেই আর ওই কবি কঙ্কন চণ্ডী আঁকতে পারতেন না। সেটা বিষয়ের দিক থেকেও যেমন, তার আকার আকৃতির দিক থেকেও তেমনি। কবি কঙ্কন চণ্ডী নামটা শুনেই বুঝতে পারছেন যে তার 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 শিকড়টা অন্য জায়গায় প্রথিত, একদম লোক সংস্কৃতিতে রয়েছে। ফলে অবনীন্দ্রনাথ তার শুরুর জীবনে আঁকছেন কৃষ্ণ লীলা, আর এই কবি কঙ্কন চণ্ডীর সমসায়িক আসছেন যে 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 ছবিগুলো, সেগুলো যতই কৃষ্ণের জীবন নিয়ে হোক, সেটা ওই আগের ওই ধ্রুপদী ঐতিহ্যের দিকে ফিরে যাওয়ার কোনো চেষ্টা তার আর নেই। ততদিন অনেকটা লৌকিক শিল্পের দিকে এগিয়ে গেছে। আর লৌকিক শিল্প হলেই যে সেটা আধুনিক হবে এবং সেটা আগেরটার সাথে মিল থাকবে না তাও নয়, কারণ লৌকিক শিল্প নিয়ে আঁকলে কি হয় সেটার একটা উদাহরণ তো যামিনী রায় নিজে। লৌকিক শিল্প থেকে আধুনিক শিল্প যদি আহরণ করে তার 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 উপাদান খোঁজে, তাহলে কি হতে পারে তার একটা উদাহরণ হচ্ছে নন্দলাল বসুর হরিপুরা চিত্র। এই সবকটাকে যদি আমরা পাশাপাশি রেখে দেখতে পারি তাহলেই হয়তো এই ভারতীয় আধুনিক চিত্রচর্চার শুরুর দিকের কাহিনীটাকে আরেকটু কম জটিল করে দেখবো, কারণ জটিলতা কমিয়ে দেখার একটা প্রয়োজনীয়তা আছে। জটিলতা কমালে বরঞ্চ আমরা ওই স্টিম রোলার চালিয়ে সবকিছু এক করে ফেলি। শান্তিনিকেতনে কোনোদিনই ওই বেঙ্গল স্কুল ঘরানা শিকড় পায়নি, কারণ এখানে যার উপস্থিতি অত্যন্ত সজাগ ছিল এবং সজোরে যার উপস্থিতি ছিল তিনি হচ্ছেন রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর, যিনি নিজে ছবির চর্চা করেছেন এতটাই মুক্ত যেখানে ওই বেঙ্গল স্কুলের মানে কণামাত্র নেই। বরঞ্চ তিনি মানে প্রাণ খুলে মানে নির্মোহ হয়ে তিনি পশ্চিমী শৈল থেকে আহরণ করছেন, কিন্তু করে যে ছবিটা আঁকছেন তার সাথে কিন্তু কোনো সরাসরি কোনো নির্দিষ্ট পশ্চিমী শিল্পীকে বা শিল্পধারাকে আর মিলানো যাচ্ছে না, সেটা রবীন্দ্রনাথের ছবি হয়ে উঠছে। এই যে একজন শিল্পী যিনি প্রথাগত শিক্ষা লাভ না করেও শিল্পী হয়ে উঠলেন, ওই যে জন্য রবীন্দ্রনাথ বলেছিলেন যে আমি তো শিল্পী নয়, যদি হতাম তাহলে দেখিয়ে দিতাম কি করা উচিত ছিল। এটা তিনি লিখছেন, এদের দুই ভাইপোকে লিখছেন, পবন ঠাকুর এবং গগন ঠাকুর লিখছেন যে মানে নিষ্ফল আক্রোশে লিখছেন যে আমার হাত দিয়ে তো ছবি বেরোয় না, বেরোলে দেখাতাম কি হতো। এবং সেটা যখন বেরোতে শুরু করলো তখন প্রায় 2000 যা ছবি রেখে গেলেন সেটা নিয়ে আজ অব্দি আমরা এখনো ঠিক বুঝে উঠতে পারছি না যে সেগুলো কি।
আর একটা আপনি যে তিনটে যে খুব স্বাভাবিক যে কিউবিজম, ইমপ্রেশনালিজম এন্ড
সেটা হচ্ছে এই কোটেশনটা হচ্ছে ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপের ক্যাটালগ থেকে, যেটা 1953 এর ক্যাটালগ। এই 1953 এর ক্যাটালগেতে ওরা তিনটে পশ্চিমী শিল্পধারাকে উল্লেখ করছে যে এখান থেকে আহরণ করতে আমাদের কোনো লজ্জা নাই। আমরা ইমপ্রেশনিজম থেকে আহরণ করতে পারি, আমরা করেছি, আমরা কিউবিজম থেকে নিতে পারি, আমরা সারিয়ালিজম থেকে নিতে পারি। যদি খেয়াল করে দেখি এই শিল্প মুভমেন্ট গুলোর তারিখগুলো যদি খেয়াল করি তাহলে দেখবো একটা হচ্ছে আর্লি 19th সেঞ্চুরি, আর একটা প্রায় মধ্যযুগে, এবং তার পরেরটা সারিয়ালিজম তো অনেক পরের দিকে। এবং এই তিনটে শিল্প আন্দোলনের মধ্যে মধ্যে আরো অনেক কিছু ঘটেও গেছে, কিন্তু ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপের শিল্পীরা যখন উল্লেখ করছেন পশ্চিমী চিত্রচর্চা, তখন তারা ওই ছাঁকনি দিয়ে ছিকে বার করে তিনটে জিনিসকে বেছে নেবেন, এবং সেই তিনটে জিনিসের মধ্যে কি বাঁচলেন এটা একটু আমাদের একটু ভেবে দেখার দরকার। যখন ইমপ্রেশনিজম, হোয়াট ডাজ ইট স্ট্যান্ড ফর, কিউবিজম, হোয়াট ডাজ ইট স্ট্যান্ড ফর, এন্ড সারিয়ালিজম, হোয়াট ডাজ ইট স্ট্যান্ড ফর, কেন সেগুলো এই ভারতীয় শিল্পীদের কাছে এত উল্লেখযোগ্য হয়ে দাঁড়াবে যে জন্য তারা সরাসরি সেগুলোকে উল্লেখ করছেন তাদের ক্যাটালগ নোটের। ইমপ্রেশনিজম কি অর্থে ট্র্যাডিশন থেকে ভেঙে বেরোনো, এবং সেই একবার যখন ভেঙে বেরোনো হলো তখন তার থেকে কয়েক ধাপ আরো আগে কি করে ফবিজম এগোতে পারলো, যেখানে সেটা কিউবিজমও নয় এবং সেটা ইমপ্রেশনিজমও নয়। ফলে কিউবিজম কি এবং ইমপ্রেশনিজম কি, এবং তারপরে তৃতীয় প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে তাহলে সারিয়ালিজম কি। এই যে তিনটে ধারাকে উল্লেখ করছেন, যেখানেতে এই সচেতন জগৎ থেকে, তার কল্পনা থেকে ছবি না আঁকে বলছেন অবচেতন জগৎ থেকে কেন ছবি আঁকতে পারবো না। তার মানে ঘুমিয়ে ঘুমিয়ে ছবি আঁকা নয়, ঘুমন্ত অবস্থায় ছবি আঁকার কথা বলছে না, বলছে যে ওই অবচেতনে যে ধরনের চিত্রের নির্যাস রয়ে গেছে অভিজ্ঞতার মধ্যে, আমাদের ঘুমের মধ্যে, আমাদের নাইটমেয়ার্স এর মধ্যে, সেটা ছবি হবে না কেন? কেবলই এই সচেতন জগতের যুক্তিগ্রাহ্যতা দিয়ে ছবি কেন আঁকবো? যুক্তিগ্রাহ্যতার পারে কেন যেতে পারবো না, এবং সেটাই বা কেন যথেষ্ট আধুনিক ছবি কেন হবে না? এইটা ছিল তাদের মূল প্রশ্ন, যে জন্য ফ্রয়েডের সাইকোঅ্যানালিসিস তাদের কাছে এত ভালো লেগেছে। ইন্টারপ্রিটেশন অফ ড্রিমস তাদের কাছে একটা প্রায় গসপেলের মতো এই জন্যই ছিল। কিন্তু এই জন্য নয় যে জন্য ফ্রয়েড চেয়েছিলেন সাইকোঅ্যানালিসিসের জন্য, কারণ ফ্রয়েডের কাছে সেটা একটা থেরাপিউটিক ইউজ। কি করে থ্রু সাইকোঅ্যানালিসিস অ্যানোমালিসকে কারেক্ট করা যেতে পারে, যেখানে সারিয়ালিস্টরা বলছে যে হিস্টেরিয়ার এত বছর পূর্তি আমরা সেলিব্রেট করছি, সেলিব্রেটিং দ্য অ্যানিভার্সারি অফ হিস্টেরিয়া। হিস্টোরিয়া বেঁচে থাকলে বরঞ্চ ছবি হবে। তাকে চিকিৎসা করে সারিয়ে তোলার কোনো চেষ্টা তাদের নেই, মানে মূলগত লক্ষ্যটা আলাদা, কিন্তু একটা মিল রয়েছে, একটা সৌহার্দ্য রয়েছে দুটোর মধ্যে। জানি না কতটা উত্তর হলো।
আবার আপনার বক্তৃতা বা বলা শোনার আগ্রহ, মানে অপেক্ষায় রইলাম। যদি কখনো খবর পাই কোথাও আপনি বলছেন অন্য কারোর ছবি বা ইয়ে নিয়ে, আমি ডেফিনেটলি শুনতে যাবো। আমার এত ভালো লেগেছে।
যদি ওপেন অনলাইন লেকচারস থাকে আমি লিংক শেয়ার করব।
নিশ্চয়ই যামিনী রায়ের বা ইয়েদের উপরেও আপনার
আনফরচুনেটলি কিছুদিন আগেই ছিল, তবে সেটা তো বিচিত্র বিষয়। এই কত তারিখে ছিল ওটা? 17 তারিখে ছিল। 17 তারিখে ছিল ভুবনেশ্বরে একটা লেকচার ছিল। সেটা একটা বিচিত্র বিষয়, মানে আমার নিজেরই বাছার বিষয়, কিন্তু সেটা নিয়ে আমি ভেবেছিলাম ল্যাজিক ওপরে হয়ে যাবো, কিন্তু কোনো মতে বেঁচে গেছি। সেটা হচ্ছে অমর চিত্র কথার একটা ইস্যু, যেটা এলিফ্যান্টা গুহা নিয়ে। সেটা গোটা অমর চিত্র কথার যাবতীয় যে তথাকথিত শিশু সাহিত্য নয়, কিন্তু তার মধ্যে থেকে এটি ব্যতিক্রম, এইটা প্রমাণ করার একটা আপ্রাণ চেষ্টা করেছিলাম। সেটা প্রায় শিল্প ইতিহাস হতে হতে হয়নি এরকম একটা জিনিস। তো এইটা নিয়ে একটা 1 ঘন্টার লেকচার ছিল। তাতে যে অডিয়েন্সকে বলেছিলাম তাদের কতটা বোর করেছে আমি জানি না, কিন্তু বলতে গিয়ে অন্তত আমার কিছু ধারণা স্পষ্ট হয়েছে, যেখান থেকে সেটাকে আরেকবার পুনর্বার লেখা দরকার আছে, রিরাইটিং দরকার, এটুকু বুঝতে পারছি।
বোর হওয়ার তো কোনো প্রশ্নই নেই,
সেইটা একটা
তবে আমাদের জ্ঞান এতটাই সীমিত যে আপনার এটা নেওয়ার ক্ষমতাটা আমাদের কম আর কি।
না কি হয় বলুন তো, আপনারা আপনাদের প্রত্যেকের নিজ নিজ বৃত্তে প্রতিনিয়ত প্রতিদিন বিচরণ করছেন। আমি যেহেতু আমার বৃত্তে সারাক্ষণ থাকি, আমি তার মধ্যে থেকে ভাবছি বলে হয়তো এমনও হচ্ছে যে আমি যা বলছি আমি ভেবেও দেখছি না যে এটা সেই বৃত্তের বাইরের লোকজনের কাছে ঠিক কিভাবে গিয়ে পৌঁছাচ্ছে। এটা আমার কাছে একটা শিক্ষা যে অন্যদের কাছে বলতে গেলে কতটা গেল বা গেল না সেটা আমি ধরতে পারছি তো নাকি পারছি না, আমি তো আমার মতো করে বলে গেলাম।
না সবাই সে বিষয়ে মানে সবাই মন্ত্রমুগ্ধের মতনই শুনেছে, যেহেতু এটা মানে
সেটাই তো মুশকিল, মন্ত্রমুগ্ধ হয়ে গিয়ে যদি চুপ করে বসে গেলেন তাহলে আর কি হলো।
না আসলে 1940-এর দশকটা যেটা আপনি আলোচনা করলেন, সেটা আমরা আমি মৌসুমী ইচ্ছা করেই আসলে আমরা চেয়েছিলাম যে এই বিষয়টা নিয়ে আলোচনা হোক। আর আপনি যেহেতু ডিএজি-তে বলেছিলেন এটা আমি জানি, তাই জন্য গোপাল ঘোষের কথা আমাদের মাথায় ছিল। তো যেহেতু খুব তো আলোচনা হয় না, আমাদের তো সেই সুযোগ হয় না গোপাল ঘোষের সম্পর্কে।
গোপাল ঘোষ তো আমাদের শোনাই হয় না কখন, বা ছবিও আমরা দেখাচ্ছি।
হ্যাঁ, নন্দলাল বসু আমরা লাস্ট শুনেছি।
গোপাল ঘোষ নিয়ে আমি এই কলকাতায় দেলিয়ার গ্যালারির যে বক্তব্যটা ছিল সেটা বোধহয় এই শিল্পীকে নিয়ে আমার বলা 3 নম্বর। আচ্ছা, সুমনা বসু ইজ রেজড এ হ্যান্ড। নিশ্চয়ই হাত রেজ করার দরকার নেই, বলে ফেলুন।
হ্যাঁ, আমি একটা প্রশ্ন করছি, একেবারেই এই ক্ষেত্রটায় আমি কিচ্ছু জানি না, একবারে নভিস বলা যায়, তো সেই কারণেই হয়তো খুব বোকা বোকা প্রশ্নই করছি। তাও জিজ্ঞেস করছি যে ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপের মধ্যে আমরা কি কোনো মহিলা শিল্পীকে প্রমিনেন্ট হতে দেখছি? আর সুনয়নী দেবী কি এর আগে? উনি তো সুনয়নী দেবী অনেক আগে, মানে ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপের 43 নাগাদ বোধহয় প্রতিষ্ঠা হয়েছে। হ্যাঁ, আপনি যা বললেন, তাহলে এইখানে কোনো আমরা শিল্পীকে পাচ্ছি, মহিলা শিল্পীরা উঠে আসছেন?
প্রদোষ দাশগুপ্ত একজন ভাস্কর, তার স্ত্রী কমলা দাশগুপ্ত একমাত্র মহিলা শিল্পী এই গ্রুপের।
ও, কমলা দাশগুপ্ত, আচ্ছা। মানে ওনারা কি ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপটা মানে যখন আবার হয়ে যাচ্ছে ফাউন্ডার মেম্বার কজন ছিলেন ক্যালকাটা গ্রুপে? ফাউন্ডার মেম্বার এরা
মানে অনেক 8 জন ছিলেন, আমি যদি খুব ভুল না করি।
আচ্ছা, গ্রুপ মানে গোপাল ঘোষ উনি ছাড়া 8 জন ছিলেন। আচ্ছা,
এটা কি কোনো সময় শান্তিনিকেতনে ছিলেন কমলা দাশগুপ্ত?
হ্যাঁ ছিলেন,
আমি মনে হচ্ছে
হ্যাঁ ছিলেন।
আমরা
যদিও শান্তিনিকেতনে তার হদিশ আমি কোথাও পাচ্ছি না, কিন্তু তিনি ছিলেন এবং বেশ অনেকটা সময় ছিলেন, এটা আমি খবর পাচ্ছি, কিন্তু তার কোনো হদিশ বলতে আমি এখানে থাকাকালীন কি করলেন মূলত ভাস্কর ছিলেন, ভাস্কর্য করলেন, ছবি ড্রয়িং করলেন, আঁকলেন, কি করলেন তার একটাও নিদর্শন খুঁজে পাচ্ছি না কথা। খুবই আনফরচুনেট সেটা। দেবায়ন স্যার, ক্যান ইউ প্লিজ আস্ক মাই কোয়েশ্চেন ফর মি? হ্যাঁ, কি প্রশ্ন?
স্যার কিছুক্ষণ আগে একটা প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে, আমি একটু স্যার
উনিও করতে পারেন তো, যিনি করছিলেন। ওনাকে তো কেউ মুখে জিপার লাগিয়ে দেয়নি। উনিও করতে পারেন, আপনিও করতে পারেন, কোনোটাতে আপত্তি নেই।
আচ্ছা স্যার, উনি লিখেছেন, are there any books like an omnibus that contains all the works of Jamini Roy, Abanindranath Tagore and other great masters of the Bengal School of Art,
No.
like the Great Artist series by Marshall Cavendish?
না,
এরকম কিছু আছে কিনা?
ইয়েস এন্ড নো। ললিত কলা থেকে 3 ভলিউম বেরোনোর কথা ছিল, তার প্রথম ভলিউম বেরিয়েছে, তারপরে বেরোয়নি। আনফরচুনেটলি সেই দ্বিতীয় এবং তৃতীয় ভলিউম যাদের করার কথা ছিল এডিটিং, তাদের মধ্যে কেউ আর ইহজগতে নাই বলেই সেটা হয়তো শেষ হতে পারেনি, amongst the many other problems. আর যদি এই অর্থে কম্পেন্ডিয়ামের খোঁজ করা যায়, তার মধ্যে প্রচুর ছবি দেখতে পাবো, তাহলে একটি বই বেরিয়েছে, কিন্তু সেটাতে আবার যেহেতু ওই কিরকম বলতো, এটা পশ্চিমী জগতে খুব খুব দেখা যায় যে হিস্ট্রি অফ ওয়েস্টার্ন আর্ট বলে একটা গোটা ভলিউম, 800 পাতা 900 পাতা, যার মধ্যে সেই প্রাগৈতিহাসিক যুগ থেকে একদম আজকে অব্দি সমস্ত কিছু একটু একটু করে ছুঁয়ে গেছে। এরকম বই এখনো পর্যন্ত ভারতীয় পরিপ্রেক্ষিতে বোধহয় একটির কথাই আমি জানি, তাও সেটা ওই প্রাগৈতিহাসিক থেকে আজ অব্দি নয়, কিন্তু আধুনিক যুগটাকে ধরার চেষ্টা আছে। 3 জন লেখকের এডিট করা এবং থেমস অ্যান্ড হাডসন থেকে বেরোনো। আমি ডিটেলটা কাউকে একটা হোয়াটসঅ্যাপ করে দিতে পারি, একটু খুঁজে দেখতে পারেন। কিন্তু সেখানেও যেটা সমস্যা হবে সেটা হচ্ছে যে এমন উদাহরণ নেই ছবিতে যেখান থেকে ধরুন জামিনী রায়কে সম্পূর্ণ বুঝলাম, বা অন্তত মোটামুটি বোঝা গেল, অবনীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুরকেও মোটামুটি সবটা বোঝা গেল, নেই। এতটাই নির্বাচিত উদাহরণ সেখানে ছাপা আছে ছবির দিক থেকে, যেখানেতে সম্যক ধারণা করা কিন্তু খুব সহজ হবে না। এখনো পর্যন্ত ভারতীয় শিল্পের ক্ষেত্রে এবং ভারতীয় শুধু আধুনিক নয়, ভারতীয় শিল্পের ক্ষেত্রেই এটা অল এনকম্পাসিং কম্পেন্ডিয়াম অফ বুক অন ইন্ডিয়ান আর্ট, এটা খুব কমই আছে, নেই। কিরকম পাওয়া যায়, ধরুন একটা বইয়ের উল্লেখ করি, সুজান হান্টিংটন এবং জন সি হান্টিংটনের লেখা আর্ট অফ এনশিয়েন্ট ইন্ডিয়া, সমস্ত সাদা কালো ছবি, কিন্তু এটা একটা এক্সটেন্সিভ এক্সস্টিভ বই অন ইন্ডিয়ান আর্কিটেকচার অ্যান্ড স্কাল্পচার। এর মধ্যে পেন্টিং এর অংশ